Back in August, when I was putting together the worship schedule, I do put it together in August, believe it or not. I noticed that the Soul Matters theme for January was practicing resistance. And I thought, oh, I can preach on Bonhoeffer. And that idea probably sounds much more exciting to me, than to many of you. Some of you may be wondering, and who is that? If you saw the 2024 film, Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Spy, Assassin, then you've encountered one version of the story of this Lutheran pastor and theologian who resisted the Nazi takeover of the church, led an underground seminary, and was eventually imprisoned and executed for his involvement in resistance activities, including a plot to assassinate Hitler. Back in August, I had this sense that Bonhoeffer's life and historical moment might be relevant to our own. But wow, the administration's attempt to rewrite the history of January 6th was a peaceful protest, and the murder of Renee Nicole Good in Minneapolis this week by an ICE agent, and the lies spun afterwards to justify her killing by labeling her a domestic terrorist, made painfully clear just how close the parallels are. And these are only the latest in escalating assault on the Constitution, on the rule of law, and on our very lives, citizen or not. For many of us, I know resistance feels like an ethical imperative, and yet how to resist and to what end can feel overwhelming. It is very easy to feel helpless. History is being rewritten, truth is being dismissed, people are disappearing, people are dying, people and institutions are being threatened into silence and compliance, and families and communities are being torn apart by fear and hate. Bonhoeffer knew that. He knew that feeling. Writing from prison, he asked, "Here, has there ever been a people in history who in their time like us had so little ground under their feet? And with each passing day, it feels more and more uncertain as to what the future of this country, this society, maybe even the globe looks like. We're in one of those enormous change moments." So, how did Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a brilliant young Lutheran pastor and theologian from a prominent German family, meet the uncertain and terrifying future of his country and his time when he had so little ground under his feet? And how did his faith help him see clearly and early what was at stake and discern a way forward? I'll be honest, it's a very complicated story. I listened to an 8-episode podcast, so I'm not going to get to everything. You'd be glad to hear. And he's been mythologized to a large extent. He's a real hero to many. I find him compelling, though, not just because of his heroic stance against the Nazis, but because his faith challenged him and it changed him to meet the times with humility and with wonder and with openness to love, both of his God and of neighbor. Bonhoeffer grew up in the long shadow of World War I. He lost his oldest brother, and there was a social collapse that followed in Germany with its defeat. And he studied theology at a time when German liberal theology was at the height of its influence. Even when I was in seminary, all those German theologians were still big, deeply intellectual and scholarly, and often detached from lived experience. And attending church was a cultural expectation rather than a religious one in many ways. In fact, the German Protestant church, as well as the Catholic church, and even the Jewish synagogues, were supported by the state. The buildings, the pastors, the priests, the rabbis, the seminaries, the schools were all paid for by taxes. And as 70% of Germans were Protestant Christians, being Christian and being German were very much tied together culturally as one and the same. And Bonhoeffer excelled in this world. By the age of 24, he had earned 2 PhDs in theology, and he could have easily remained a respected theologian, but he wanted to become a pastor, but he was too young. He had to wait till he was 25. So he decided to take a year at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And there he encountered Christians and forms of Christianity that were really different from what he had known in Germany. He became close friends with Jean Lasserre, who was a French pacifist and pastor. And even though they were supposed to be enemies, given the war, they found that they had more in common, having suffered so many losses in their generation and struggles from living through war. But perhaps more importantly, Bonhoeffer met Albert Franklin Fisher, an African-American seminarian who brought him to the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. And there he encountered an embodied, defiant, and joyful faith, a Christianity that didn't lift up Jesus as the triumphant supporter of either the Pharaoh or Caesar, but challenged that. A Jesus who stood with the suffering, and a God of love, not judgment. A community ruled often by, living under terrible umbrella of injustice, but yet grounded in hope. And what he heard there, especially a sermon he heard on the Sermon on the Mount, transformed his theology and his whole understanding of discipleship. He realized that Christianity was not a justification for triumphant national identity. It was a calling to love one's neighbor, no matter who that neighbor is. And to follow Jesus was to live and practice loving one's neighbor in community, working for them for justice, for love in this world and not for the next. Bonhoeffer returned to Germany in 1931. Now he was ordained, and he was sent to serve as a kind of youth minister in one of Berlin's poorest neighborhoods. And there he encountered the same level of poverty and oppression that he had seen in Harlem in his own country. And as Hitler rose to power, Bonhoeffer watched with alarm as the state co-opted the church even more, promising a national renewal while demanding obedience and purity within the congregations, within the church. For Hitler ordered that the Protestant church enforce the Aryan Clause, removing anyone of Jewish descent, even if they had converted to Christianity, from the churches as members of the church, not just from the bureaucracies and from civil roles, but from the churches as well. Bonhoeffer refused, and along with other refusing pastors and theologians who were worried about this, he helped form what became known as the Confessing Church in Germany. Christians who insisted that their loyalty belonged to God first and not the state. And as part of this, Bonhoeffer was asked to lead an underground seminary to train young pastors in this confessing church, since they weren't welcome at the other ones, at Finkenwalde in Pomerania. And he offered a radical model for seminary. I actually would have really liked this. He didn't focus primarily on the academics of theology. Instead, he focused on forming community, the practices of community, and the rituals of it: daily prayer, shared meals, mutual care, and deep attention to the practices of discipleship. Because he believed that resistance in the face of what they were experiencing had to be more than just proclamation and protest. People needed community strong enough to help them sustain the courage and the clarity and the compassion over time. As he wrote, one of my favorite quotes, "The person who loves their dream of community will destroy community, but the person who loves those around them will create community wherever they go." In 1935, Hitler declared an end to the Treaty of Versailles and rearmed Germany. And as war came, the underground seminary was shut down. Bonhoeffer students faced conscription or arrest. Convinced that resistance could no longer remain within the church alone, Bonhoeffer worked as a double agent, using his ecumenical contacts in Europe to move money, share information, and try to help Jews escape through Switzerland. And he came to believe that following Jesus meant working alongside anyone, Christian or not, who loved their neighbor and resisted injustice. Eventually, Bonhoeffer became involved, mostly indirectly, in a plot to assassinate Hitler. He knew that it violated his deepest convictions as a Christian, and he prayed for his soul for making this choice. He just didn't know any other way. Because he also believed that refusing to act in the face of such profound evil will carry its own moral guilt. The plot failed, as we know. He was actually arrested before it was implemented. He was arrested in 1943, and he spent 2 years in prison. And it was there that he wrote some of his most important theological reflections that were later published as letters and papers from prison. And in those, he argued that Christianity's long entanglement with empire had hollowed out the church's moral witness. He wrote, "We can be Christians today only in 2 ways, through prayer and through doing justice among human beings." In April 1945, just before the war ended, Bonhoeffer was executed at the Flossenburg concentration camp as his involvement in this assassination plot was found out. By many measures, Bonhoeffer's resistance failed. Seminary closed, the plots failed. He could not convince his ecumenical allies to help him or others resist Hitler. He did not live to see the end of the war. But Bonhoeffer did not act because he believed he would win. He acted because his faith compelled him to love the world as it was for the sake of what it could become. And I think that is what practicing resistance looks like, not investing in the certainty of success, not investing in moral purity, but in faithfulness, grounded in community, sustained by prayer and meditation, and expressed through love of neighbor. It's interesting to me that in 1936, a young Unitarian minister named James Luther Adams, whose words we opened with, visited the confessing church and met with several of the dissident theologians, probably including Bonhoeffer. And Adams' witness to the events in Germany under the Nazis and the resistance solidified his own belief that the role of the church is to be a prophetic community in covenant with one another and with what he called that sustaining and transforming power not made with human hands, a love greater than us. And Adams believed for in order for that to happen, churches must be free. They cannot be part of the state. I find it hard not to be concerned, afraid, disturbed by the parallels between what is happening in our country today and what Bonhoeffer witnessed in the 1930s. It feels like we have so little ground under our feet. And on the surface, Bonhoeffer's story is not necessarily a comforting one. As I said, his attempts at resistance failed in his lifetime. But it reminds me to remember that we are in the middle of the story right now. We do not know how it will turn out any more than Bonhoeffer knew how it would turn out. And it may take a generation or two. I don't think it's an accident that Bonhoeffer's life and writings are resurfacing. They offer us both a warning and a way through. Resistance is not a single heroic act. It is a practice. It is a discipline. It is a way of living and being together in a community that refuses silence, refuses dehumanization, even of all people, even those who we feel are making mistakes. And a community that refuses to surrender love to fear, even when that cost is high. One of the most powerful forms resistance we are witnessing today is precisely that. Love of neighbor. Love that shows up, love that refuses to comply with injustice, and that speaks truth to power. Love that insists on human dignity. And it is the kind of love that costs Renee Nicole Good her life. And that's a reality of this time. And yet it is that kind of love that remains still our calling. So it is really good that we have one another.